Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to our audience here at Think Corner and to the attendees joining via live stream. On behalf of the Finnish Society for Development Research, I extend to everyone our gratitude for your attendance and for celebrating with us our 40th anniversary. This public forum is part of the pre-conference events of our development days. As we turn 40, we are celebrating not only by looking back for self-reflection, but more importantly, by looking forward, honestly and urgently. That is why the theme of our forum is a question: whose future, posed against the backdrop of a world in rupture. And this is also one of the main reasons why we are proud to collaborate with our colleagues at Global Visions, a uniquely progressive association that consistently challenges the world as it is by envisioning a world as it should be. We are honored to have distinguished scholar activists from the Global South as our guests, Walden Bello and Robdel Paley. One of the distinctive practices of the Finnish Society for Development Research in organizing our annual Development Days conference is that we make accessible to the public the intellect of our notable keynote speakers. To all participants, this is your forum. This is our democratic space. Whether you are here in Helsinki or watching from abroad, we invite you to engage, to challenge, and to imagine with us. But before I hand over to our moderators, Max Talberg and Astrid Aminoff, I sincerely thank our keynote speakers for making the long journey to be with us in the depths of a Helsinki winter. Cold, wet, muddy, and inconvenient. In a world of inhumane walls and violent borders, your presence here represents the kind of cross-border solidarity we so desperately need.
Welcome everyone on behalf of the Global Visions Association as well. My name is Max Talberg and I'm the founder and chairperson at Global Visions. We act as a platform for the discussion on how the state of the world can be improved, especially from the point of view of global justice and equality, and we also highlight different societal visions regarding all of this. I'm honored to introduce our guests for this evening's event. Firstly, Walden Bello, who is a world-renowned scholar and activist, honorary senior research fellow at SUNY Binghamton and former professor at the University of the Philippines. As the co-founder of Focus on the Global South, he received the Right Livelihood Award, often called the Alternative Nobel Prize, and has served in the Philippine House of Representatives. In 2023, Amnesty International Philippines named him Most Distinguished Human Rights Defender. He is the author of 25 books, including Global Battlefields. And Robdel Paley, who is assistant professor at the London School of Economics, LSE, a Liberian scholar activist working at the intersection of critical development, African and race studies. She examines structural transformation in crisis-affected regions of the Global South. Her award-winning book, Development, Dual Citizenship and its Discontents in Africa, has received major international recognition, including the African Politics Conference Group Best Book Award and LSE's Rising Star Impact Prize. And Bon Juego, who is a political economist and senior lecturer in international development studies at the University of Jyväskylä. He currently serves as chair of the Finnish Society for Development Research. With a transdisciplinary background, his research focuses on the Global South, with particular emphasis on Southeast Asia and North-South relations. His recent work explores the crisis and potential alternatives to capitalism, examining its political, economic, socio-ecological, and technological dimensions.
Okay, well, thank you everyone on my behalf as well. I'm Astrid Aminov, the project planner at Global Visions, and I will be moderating this section of the discussion. Let's get right into it. So, I would like to begin by reflecting on this moment in time, that is, the current state of the world. The beginning of 2026 has already felt like quite a turning point in terms of geopolitics, the multilateral system, and the international order. So my first question is, looking at the global landscape today, what stands out to you or perhaps worries you the most? And I was hoping that Robdel could begin the discussion, and then Walden and Von can comment.
Sure. Thank you so much, Astrid, for the question. I had a feeling you were going to ask me first because you were looking at me very intently. Okay, so in terms of this moment, I think for me, the sort of crumbling facade of what seems to be an international rules-based order has fundamentally showed us that the rules-based order actually has never existed. That in many respects, rules only really apply to the poor and the seemingly powerless, not to the prosperous and the powerful. And so for me, for the prosperous and the powerful, essentially might makes right. And we're seeing that so glaringly obvious in terms of the geopolitical landscape. Not only does might make right, brute force seems to be the weapon of choice for a lot of institutions, for a lot of powerful individuals, for a lot of countries that wield considerable clout and power. And I think we can come up with a number of different examples. So I'll just rattle them off because I think everybody in this room will be familiar with the fact that there is a genocide taking place in Palestine right now. We also see a US that has imperial kind of tendencies, not only in places like looking at Greenland, but also in Venezuela, where they've actually kidnapped a sitting head of state. Now, whether you have issues with Maduro or not, the fact of the matter is there was a kidnapping of a head of state and a removal of a head of state and his wife. And I think what's led subsequently to that is this sort of stranglehold that's been placed on a place like Cuba, a communist regime in Cuba. We also see Russia's neo-imperial ambitions in Ukraine. And from what I remember, is it this week or last week that marks the 4th year anniversary of this particular war. We also see the Epstein scandal has solidified for us the implication of powerful men across the world who believe as if no rules apply to them. We've seen punishing unconstitutional US tariffs take precedence across the globe in which countries in the so-called global south are at the receiving end of economic inequality. And then last but certainly not least, most troubling is US aggression against Iran. So for me, all of these examples fundamentally demonstrate that a rules-based order has never existed. And if it does exist in its actuality, those rules really only apply to the poor and those who are seemingly powerless. And the reason I say seemingly powerless is because in the academic literature, maybe even in the public discourse, no one is powerless. There's a quote that I often share with my students at the London School of Economics in which Indian author and academic Arundhati Roy argues that there's no such thing as the powerless. There's no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. And I think in many respects, when we're thinking about these examples at the geopolitical level, there are many people who are being deliberately silenced and preferably unheard.
Thank you, Robdel. Would Walden like to comment?
Yes, I think the biggest worry that I have at this point is Donald Trump. And let me just say that in terms of a personality influencing the course of events, I don't think we've seen anybody like him since Osama bin Laden. Basically, I think Osama basically transformed the first decade of the 21st century. And now Trump is following the same way. In terms of a personal impact, The second thing I would say here is, that is very much summed up by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci that everybody is probably familiar with. But let me just say that Gramsci characterized the 1930s as, quote, "the old world is dying and the new one is struggling to be born. Now is the time of monsters." I think what Gramsci was saying there is that every period undergoes a rupture or transformation that has both negative and positive aspects. And let me start with a negative at this point, because basically Trump is impacting the world in a very dangerous way with his sort of push to withdraw from all the rules, whether economic or political or multilateral rules, which Rob Tell did say were basically biased for the for the rich countries. So this injects a period of uncertainty. So, and I feel that that is more negative than positive. On the other hand, globalization, corporate-driven globalization, has been left behind, pushed away by the Trump administration. And the problem really before was that corporate-driven globalization represented in the political canopy of the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, was really structurally disadvantageous to the global South. So with this corporate-driven globalist order now that we're moving away from that, partly because of Trump's actions, there's also the space that is opening up, for alternative ways to have a global order that may, in fact, and can be made much more, how would you call it now, positive in terms of the way that countries of the global South can be accommodated and have, and have much more power and a greater opportunity to have new rules to structure the world. So I think that that this is the positive and the negative sides of this era, this transformative era. And I would say that it's up to us whether we take the bull by the horns and try to push for a more positive global order that is sensitive to the needs of the vast majority of the people in the world. And I think we can be effective as agents in this very fluid period and not leave it up to people like Trump and the other powerful governments and countries to monopolize decision-making for this period. So again, let me just say that whenever you have an era like this, you have monsters appearing. And one of those monsters is Donald Trump. But it's unavoidable that these monsters appear. But it is up to us to slay them. I mean, figuratively, not physically.
Thank you, Walden. Bon, lots of thoughts there.
Yeah, I agree with both our keynote speakers. I'm a student of political economy. So I study capitalism. And what worries me most is how capitalism is evolving or has evolved. I'm not defending capitalism. I'm a critic of capitalism. But as a process, it can lead to different tendencies. But what is happening in global capitalism at this time, what we are seeing is classic imperialism. It's really a violent form of capitalism brought about by hyper-competition. Yeah, it could lead to monopoly, but what we are witnessing is the response of a hegemon in decline. Yeah, the United States is losing its hegemony technologically, economically, socioculturally. But they're doing, but the US is saving their hegemony, not quietly. It won't be easy for them to give up power. So you see that behavior in Donald Trump at this time. Many of the analysts are saying it's the end of capitalism as we know it. No, this is actually capitalism. Because violence in capitalism is not something accidental. It is very much embedded or intrinsic in the logic of capitalist accumulation. And what worries me the most is actually war. Of course, there's climate change, but war can easily kill us and blow up this world, yeah, in an instant. And we know that imperialist wars are the ultimate wasters of nature and human lives. And for me, this is very dangerous. So, because capitalism can also evolve in different ways, like those who argue for free trade, they don't like wars from the liberal point of view. But what we are seeing in the response of Trump is the way how capitalism was started by Europe. You know, capitalism was not built on liberalism, but on nationalism. And this is also what I see in the protectionism of Trump. It's not really a retreat from globalization, but it's just a response to the hyper-competition of the stage of capitalism that we have, that no state, not even the United States, can control anymore.
Thank you, Bon. Any thoughts, Robtel or Walden, before we move on to the next question? Let's move on then. So the next question, I would like Walden to start. But basically, we often hear that we're moving into a multipolar world, a world with many centers of power. But in this global condition, who gets to decide what the problems are and how to solve them? In such a multipolar world, is there real room for agency, for more power to the people?
Yes, I would say that the emergence of a multicentric or multipolar world has more positive than negative aspects to it. We have to realize that we're living at a period when there was supposed to be only one route to the future, which was the neoliberal, free trade, market-led route. And for us in the Global South, we were being pushed into this. And the people that were wielding the whip were the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. And we were told, that we were being whipped into a prosperous future. And so with the failure of globalization and neoliberalism, new avenues have opened up. That, in fact, the route to the future is not, just one route but there are several routes to it, and that different societies should just see what is the route to the future that responds to their interests and their values. And a multipolar world gives more space for that kind of process. Because the old world in which the United States, was leading us to a certain path, that had no space, no development space that was being afforded to our different societies. And not only the Global South, but also countries in the Global North. And many of them suffered from this because the neoliberal idea was that government was bad, social security, all of these things in which government was taking the lead, was creating inefficiencies, and people were suffering, from the kind of prescriptions of neoliberalism in the North as well as in the Global South. Now, with a multipolar world, where you have, for instance, the BRICS formation, Brazil, Russia, India, China, despite all their contradictions, they afford, more space. You also have the possible emergence of alliances of middle powers, and one of them, one suggestion that was made by the former Prime Minister of Finland was sort of the Nordic countries sort of being part of this multipolar world, coordinated part. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that you then have all of these different centers in Southeast Asia, for instance. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations can become more active in this process because it doesn't have to worry anymore about the IMF basically saying, hey, you've got to have capital account convertibility or openness, or the World Bank saying you can only go this route to development. So what we're saying is that all these different, some of them institutions are existing, some past institutions and some future institutions, we now have a much more fluid situation, more diverse, giving more space, for us. So I think, therefore, that it's great that the IMF is breaking up. It's great that the World Bank is breaking up. It's great that WTO is almost dead, because they occupied so much space that they left us strangulated, and now that's opening up.
Thank you, Walden. Who would like to start next?
I can go next. I love hearing Walden speak because I think he's so much more positive about the rupturing of the kind of geopolitical institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO. What's interesting about that, and I tell my students this at the LSE a lot, is what's happened in terms of the optics of these institutions is that Black and brown people are now running them. And so everybody's clapping their hands and saying, yes, this is real decolonization because Black and brown people are running institutions that are structurally unequal, such as the WTO, with Ngozi, who's the former finance minister of Nigeria, and institutions like the WHO, headed by Tedros, who's the former foreign affairs or health minister of Ethiopia, the World Bank, Ajay Banda, so forth and so on. So I love listening to you because I think you have such a hopeful way of looking at these institutions in a state of rupture. I think that they are still very much entrenched in terms of the rules or the lack thereof for some countries. But I agree with you 100% on this idea of the geopolitical centers of power shifting. I 100% agree with that. I also think that these new spaces that are being created for Southern political agency are very, very important. And the examples that I give are from more conventional convenings, such as maybe the G20. So I don't know if people in the room are aware that the G20 that was held in 2025 was the first G20 in the continent of Africa, headed by South Africa. So the last country in the BRICS region is South Africa. For me, as a Black African woman, for me, this was very, very important. It's a very important moment because not only was this the first G20 that was held on African soil, and then convened by South Africa as the head. But the fact of the matter is, if you looked at the agenda for the G20 of 2025, and I actually love that, the G20 of 2025, very historic, is that most of the items on the agenda were very, very much about the concerns, the aspirations, the challenges, not only of the continent of Africa, in terms of this geopolitical space being a stranglehold for a lot of African economies, but also representing the aspirations, the interests, the challenges of countries across the so-called global south writ large. That has never happened before, as far as I'm concerned, in my very, very small, kind of limited understanding of how G20s work. So that, for me, is a conventional space that you think would be one of the status quo, but I think South Africa showed us in 2025 that even spaces of conventional, mainstream economic, social, political planning and order can be shifted, can be challenged, can be reconfigured. I think the other convening that more traditional space or conventional space is the UN. So we've got 5 permanent members of the United Nations, which for me, in many respects, are post-World War II relic, obviously needs to be changed. But even within the United Nations, so I'll give you an example of my country, Liberia, which is a very small country in West Africa. Many of you probably have never heard of Liberia, but it does exist. Liberia is one of 3 African non-permanent members of the UN at the moment. And what these 3 African non-permanent members, with Liberia sort of leading the pack, are doing is they're pushing for complete reconfiguration of the permanent members of the United Nations. And they're doing this at a regional level where they're having discussions at the African Union and then bringing those concerns, those aspirations to the UN convening, the UN body. The other thing that I thought was quite energizing for me as a Liberian is that the non-permanent 3 African members of the UN Security Council also came down very, very hard with a very strong statement when the United Nations, or the United States invaded Venezuela. And the reason I thought that was quite energizing is because my country, Liberia, has always kowtowed to the United States, given our kind of colonial history with this country. And to see my foreign minister make a statement at the UN Security Council saying that this was brute force at its most visceral and that it needed to be condemned in the most public manner, said to me that there is definitely a shift taking place. If my country can make that kind of statement against the United States, the hegemonic United States, at the UN Security Council, then that gives me some hope in terms of these shifts, these spaces being created for Southern political agency.
Thank you, Reptel.
Yeah, about the multipolar world, my question there is, what does it mean and how does it look like? traditional international relations keep on talking about multipolar world. And you also hear that in the World Economic Forum and also coming from politicians here in Europe. So they are saying there's a core and now there are middle powers, but good thing also in the discourse, even from the president of Finland, they are now recognizing the global south. So for me, it's just like a traditional way of doing political science and international relations, but I do political economy. And for what they are not questioning is that there may be different poles, different polarities, different power centers, political power centers. But they are forgetting the elephant in the room, that there's a single universalizing economic system at play, which is capitalism. And they're not questioning that. So what we are witnessing is that capitalism can be embedded in different types of political regimes. So there can be Chinese way of doing capitalism. There can also be perhaps the Confucian way of doing capitalism, Catholic way of doing capitalism, Protestant way of doing capitalism, African way of doing capitalism. So capitalism can accommodate different political regimes and sociocultural orientations. And for me, this is the reason why we really have to problematize what will be the common thread, that ties together the different political regimes. And what is emerging right now is not what the hyper-globalists are saying, that capitalism will bring about a world of liberal democracy. But we are witnessing that capitalism is being embedded in authoritarian regimes, so authoritarian capitalism. And for me, that is problematic. So if I don't want to romanticize the global south or the BRICS and so-called middle powers, but what alternatives are they proposing? It's still the same thing. So are they offering a counter-imperialist bloc or anti-imperialist bloc, or are they simply sub-imperialist bloc? And the way they cooperate or the way they relate would still be based on the logic of competition in capitalism. And if even the global south work within that, they relate on the basis of competition rather than cooperation, it will be very problematic. It will lead to what we are witnessing right now. So, of course, there are competition for resources, and that may lead to occupation, wars of conquest, and then, of course, it's also bad for the climate. So I think in all this discussion on multipolarity, of course, we don't like unipolarity, but we need to understand that that there are different tendencies and processes at play in the world. Dependency still exists. Colonial dependency relations still exist. Europe-Africa relations still there. Global North, global South, it's still there. I don't deny that. But what is emerging at this time is also the pursuit for global competitiveness. So look at the documents, policy documents, IMF, World Bank, WTO. It's not anymore about the defense and push for U.S. interest. So they have actually taken some distance in promoting the logic of competition. So even the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO are actually suggesting that the United States should also compete with the global south, compete with the middle powers, So it's not, so this is the way I read the documents of the so-called Washington institutions now. They are not anymore instruments of a particular interest of the United States. If they were so, China could have not reasoned like that. China benefited much from the free trade war. So I think, so you still have vestiges of colonial dependence continuity, but there are also intense competition at play. So yeah, everybody has to compete. Yeah, compete. That's the logic at this time. And you hear that from Finland, you hear that from Liberia, you hear that from the Philippines. So for me, they would always say, what's the solution to monopoly or unilateralism? They would say it's competition. They look at competition as a solution, but for me, competition is a problem.
Thanks, Juan. You can continue, Abdel.
I wonder, though, I mean, I hear you in terms of, because when we get to the end, I want to talk about what the global vision is. It's abolishing capitalism. But I think, for me, if I'm looking specifically from the continent of Africa, you may or may not be aware that the continent introduced an African continental free trade area. That's an agreement that was signed a number of years ago, and it's been in the pipeline for dozens of decades. In reading those policy documents, in being a fly on the wall in terms of those policy discussions, competition wasn't the word that kept coming up, Bon, it was cooperation. So I think even within the system of capitalism, there can be cooperation where Africa has recognized that it holds a very, very small voice in terms of these kinds of deliberations and discussions. And the only way to overcome that is to do it as a regional bloc, to say, I, Liberia, have, I don't know, rubber. You, Ivory Coast, have cocoa. Why can't we trade with one another? So my comparative advantage is this. Your comparative advantage is this. Why don't we cooperate? And I think if we're thinking about the language of regional cooperation, that's where that comes from. And I think if you look at the AFCFTA, it's sort of modeling this idea of cooperation within capitalism. How do we make it work for us as a continent? So I don't think it's only about competition. I think there's also a reckoning with this idea of competition has run its course, that it actually has not served different parts of the world in a way that it should. So if countries are going to really, really make it through and sort of transform, whether nationally or regionally or continentally, then they have to figure out how to cooperate more meaningfully. And I see that in the AFCFTA, despite the fact that it's a sort of capitalist kind of endeavor.
Yeah, of course, there's this, that's the dialectics of cooperation and competition. So states really have to cooperate. That's the logic of the creating international regimes or trade regimes that which is being broken by Trump and others. And that's why the liberals are complaining about this, that you're not playing by the rules. But what I'm saying is that it's not, they always talk about rules-based orders. Yeah, this capitalism can be managed like that. But maybe that would be a more predictable capitalism, that the likes of Mark Carney and others in World Economic Forum are actually, they say we need, that regime has already been broken, and we are in a rupture. But if you understand the logic of how capitalism really evolved, it's just like that. It's just being, businessman like Donald Trump is not taught how to compete. He is taught how to monopolize. That is what is taught in business schools. Business schools don't teach you to compete. They teach you to monopolize. And Trump really understands that kind of logic. So it's only the rules that we create to discipline how capitalists should behave. For example, Bill Gates have been having charges, antitrust lawsuits. Yeah, but Yeah, you create institutions in order to have a certain degree of predictability on how capitalists would behave. But, the animal spirit of capitalism is not like that. Yeah, so that's why that somehow, I'm critical of liberalism, but still, if you have the, the rule of play and, people play by the rules, there's these rules of engagement, it would still be a better and more decent world than what we have at the moment.
Thank you, Bon. Yes, Weldon.
Thanks for the food for thought from both of you. I just wanted to issue some caveats. One is, in terms of the multilateral institutions, I don't really see them as moving away from serving U.S. interests. The U.S. Has the controlling interest in the World Bank and in the International Monetary Fund. It has 17% of the shares, which means it can veto any kind of policies that would go against U.S. interests. The U.S. basically has the WTO by their throat. It's the U.S. opposition to the Court of Appeals of the WTO, its refusal to allow judges to come in. And this was not just Donald Trump, but also Obama and Biden. So they can only go so far in terms of defying U.S. interests. Although right now, Trump is much less interested in using them than he would use U.S. government unilateral power. So I would say that we need to be careful about saying that these institutions have moved away from control of the United States. The second thing is the capitalism and neoliberalism have had a major crisis of ideological crisis. I think that the legitimacy of neoliberalism and its crisis has in fact extended to capitalism. So it's not just neoliberal capitalism, but capitalism as a way of organizing the world that has, suffered a tremendous blow to its legitimacy. In the last few decades, socialism has again become a respectable world. And politicians, even established politicians like Bernie Sanders and others, now define themselves as socialists. The new Gen Z people, are moving away from looking at capitalism as a viable route to the future, and in fact, embracing different varieties of socialism. And so, even as we see the breakup of, into this multipolar system, even if they still function within capitalism, and I agree with that, we also see contradictions, between governments and people, that's leading to tremendous questioning as to how the world should be organized. And I don't think a system that has lost a lot of legitimacy even if it continues to be de facto the fallback mechanism, I think that is not going to, that's not a permanent state. I think that ideology, ideas, the way they serve interests, and the way that they promote values, I think this is an area in which there will increasingly be more popular intervention. So I don't see capitalism as static. I see it in a defensive state at this point. Although, so I would say that even as I agree with one, that de facto, the different poles still exist within, a global capitalist system. That system itself is under assault. And I don't think that and my hope is in fact that, a lot of the new generation are looking at this system and they're saying, this isn't going to work for us. And I think the climate, especially on the climate issue, I think everybody realizes that the main driver of climate change is the capitalist mode of production. So my point is that these questions can no longer be resisted. And these are questions that promote, are the promoters of change, especially among generations of people. So those are just my caveats. While I agree with a number of points that Bon raised, I would nevertheless see this whole thing as a more dynamic. I would rather see capitalism is really in crisis. And I see that there are various defense mechanisms, like a focus on competition, but we need to see that as defensive. No mode of production can exist without a legitimizing ideological force. And I don't think capitalism has that at this point in time.
Thank you, Walden. Great points, and actually we can revisit them at the end of the discussion. I'm sure you have more comments for each other. But basically, let's now move from the big picture of global politics, which we've discussed, down to the ground level, which is the basic lives of the daily lives of people. When global powers pull back on development funding and aid, as we are seeing with the US recently and also with EU donors, what does that actually look like for ordinary families and individuals, especially among the vulnerable populations, struggling to meet even the basic needs? Do you see any other groups, countries, or institutions stepping in to help to fill the void that the EU donors and US donors are perhaps creating?
Do you want to?
If you could start, Walden.
Sorry. Well, I think this issue was brought out very prominently when Donald Trump abolished the United States Agency for International Development, which was in fact funding many family planning and related programs in many countries in the global south. On that point, I think that the people that criticized that move were right that even if it was a US institution, nevertheless, there were certain vital functions that it was performing. My take on that was that what was wrong with what Trump and what's his name now? Elon Musk did was basically that they acted so in this way to just cut it off suddenly. My sense, though, is that it is an agency of the U.S. state. And while it does some of this, activities that are, you might say, more positive than negative, it has also been an agency that has been used for different sorts of intervention in the global south. So my take on it is that moving away from dependence on U.S. aid in a gradual fashion is the way to go. Because I would really not trust any agency, of the U.S. state, because it ultimately serves U.S. interests. I think, that we are in a situation whereby that alternative development institutions need to come in to fill the gap, and that they should be institutions that should have a degree or a strong degree of popular control of those that they're supposed to be servicing. I don't think that this kind of institutions have emerged yet. But I think you do have a situation right now whereby the possibilities for them emerging, whether it's civil society organizations or CSO and government partnerships, the conditions for them to emerge are now better than before. So I would say that there are definite needs of people out there, and I think in response to those needs, there will be progressive efforts to address them. But we are in a period of flux. We saw in the past, that in the 80s and the 90s, there were civil society organized institutions in many countries, Oxfam types that did enjoy government funding, and they did promote more progressive development policies, although not completely. And I think that civil society organizations in the global north, should again push for the recreation of, such CSO-led organizations, also learning from the mistakes of their past. Okay, so I would say that that is the challenge that we confront at this point in time. But eventually, I think that where change should really take place is in global structures, not in development aid. Development aid is merely, a sort of bridge. What you really need is more equitable relations among countries that promote sustainable development at the national, regional, and international level. And the task, of course, really is how do you make development aid superfluous? That is really what we should be pushing. And civil society organizations in the North and in the Global South can cooperate in a way to make development aid superfluous and unnecessary.
Thank you, Walden.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a very shameless plug.
tomorrow.
and say that tomorrow I am doing a keynote conversation on alternative development in a post-aid world. So I have a lot of views about this, but for the sake of brevity, I'm going to be very short in saying that I agree 100% on Weldon's last point about making development aid, I would say just abolishing it 100%. So I come from the kind of aid radical from the left perspective. And that aid radical from the left perspective says that aid should be abolished because, as far as I'm concerned, it's a tool of neocolonial control. But I think if we're thinking besides kind of the extreme cases of humanitarian aid, if we're thinking about so-called development aid, I don't think development aid is a viable, development strategy, or reliance thereon. Reliance on development aid is not a viable development strategy. As far as I'm concerned, in terms of ordinary people, speaking directly to your question, I don't think they typically see the impact of international aid trickling down at all, right? They don't really see the impact of international aid in their lives. For most people, aid typically gets spent on very exorbitantly paid foreign workers who come in as technical assistants or technical advisors, often at the expense of local talent. And I've seen this having worked for the government of Liberia for 4 years during its post-war moment. We also see aid typically funding international implementing partners such as the United Nations, not necessarily local organizations. So a lot of people are talking about localization, localization, localization. But aid funding is channeled through international implementing partners, not through capacity building of local organizations. And so I think if you think about the very, 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 very small fraction of aid that gets channeled through national budgets, often that is incredibly conditional, right? And aid often supports market-friendly procedures and policies. And if you're not sort of market-friendly in your approach, for the most part, you're not going to get aid channeled through national budgets. So we can even see that in terms of the breakdown of USAID, for instance. So about 46% of USAID funding went to American contractors. Another maybe 20% of USAID funding went through UN implementing partners, and a very, very small fraction, maybe like 0.0002% went through national budgets. So I think we just need to be transparent about what we're talking about when we're talking about aid. It is a multi-billion-dollar business. Okay, I said I wasn't going to go off my tangent, so let me get back to the point in terms of how it's, what alternative kind of institutions, individuals, channels might there be to aid. And so what I see in terms of migrant transfers for me are more strategic in terms of they trickle down to households. So ordinary people, when they get migrant transfers that come in terms of remittances, they actually see that concretely in their lives, right? So they can send their children to school, they can pay for hospital bills, they can pay for transportation. For me, that's more viable than aid. But the problem with international migrant transfers as remittances is that they go to the household. They're not really used for broad-based national development. And I think if we can channel those in such a way that they move beyond the household to national broad-based development, that, for me, is a funding mechanism that can be used more strategically for socioeconomic transformation. Another thing to remember is that, in many respects, I mean, the numbers tell us a different story, that migrant remittances actually surpass ODA, and they've been surpassing ODA for years. So there's some countries like mine, Liberia, where remittances are 20% of the GDP, right? That is a large number. And that is an untapped potential in terms of resources for the so-called global south. But what we're seeing, and I don't want to talk about Trump all that much today, but I will mention him in terms of his really, really asinine policy. So what he's doing now, and the reason I know this is because I've lived in the United States, I grew up in Washington, D.C., is that he's actually taxing migrant remittances. I don't remember what the percentage is, so that any US-based individual who sends remittances abroad, it's going to be taxed even more than like a Western Union or a MoneyGram. And for me, again, the stranglehold is not just on institutions and nations, it's also on individuals. And that's a very, very dangerous precedent that is being set in terms of migrant transfers.
Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps I'll just wait for tomorrow in the keynote conversation between Rabtel, Paley, and Aya Ranta. Yeah, because I teach development, and students ask about it. When the attack on the US aid and also the withdrawal of US development financing happened, I see it in a post-colonial context and the basics of human nature. In a post-colonial context, the developmental processes are convoluted. And psychologically, many of us in development studies, even those coming from critical development tradition, are suffering from cognitive dissonance. Yeah. On the one hand, we understand that the US aid was established as a colonial and imperialist tool by the United States of America in the Cold War context. On the other hand, people need it on their day-to-day existence. So that's where the cognitive dissonance is. And I also study populism, and many of our so-called constituencies in development, or whether you are an activist, so-called poor, marginalized, and vulnerable, why do they fall for populist demagogues? And I think because in development studies, somehow as academics, we tend to, what Engels called it, the overgrowth of ideology. Yeah. And we have forgotten the law of development of human history, that mankind must, first of all, eat, drink, have shelter, clothing, before they can pursue politics, ideology, religion, arts, science, etc. And I think what development studies is teaching us, somehow, in a world of dire need, yeah, the most compelling tool and idea that we have still in development studies is actually the most basic, yeah, basically the basic needs. And somehow I'm also critical, for example, on conditional cash transfers, and then there are logics about basic incomes. But if you're a poor household, you just need to survive. And in an economy, you need cash flow for the household. Yeah, I understand all the isms and IT and isation, but I think that it's part of the reckoning that really we have to deal with among development scholars and activists, that's why they fall for the likes of Trump, Trump and Duterte in the Philippines and many others abroad, so all over the world. And but on the U.S. aid, if you see that the effect of U.S. withdrawal from funding and also representation, it's kind of uneven, and then the pace would be different. For instance, I have a friend working in the UN Women. They already felt it, looking for a job. Yeah. So if you look at the funding, it was not really a total withdrawal of US presence and influence, because fundings are still kept for their global North allies. Anything that has to do with Europe and the global White North. But anything that has to do with the global South, with gender, with climate, and all the things we hold dear in the social sciences are cut off. So it's still what we are seeing in this Trump assault is having a push towards a bifurcated world still, yeah, because the global North allies are still there, but anything that has to do with the global South, nothing, no money. And then what we are also seeing is that, as what Robdal mentioned, it's a reorientation of what's been happening in development financing is actually towards privatization. Um, uh, it was there already, but then Trump is accelerating the privatization of development financing. But in terms of who are the groups and countries, institutions stepping in to help, and well, China already said that they're not willing to step in. But I think what we do is also a form of help, our political discursive thing, because Donald Trump and Elon Musk, they are arguing on the basis of economics and finance and fiscal reasons. But these are not really fiscal strategy. These are profoundly and deeply ideological and political. The United States will never run out of money. Yeah. So that's the basic in monetary theory. So long as we break that kind of thinking ideologically, the problem is not fiscal, it's not financial, it's really political and ideological. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something on this. When Trump moved on the USAID, I wrote an article saying that in terms of aid being wasted, he was barking up the wrong tree. He should really have cut off the IMF and the World Bank because that's really where aid is really being wasted and where US money is being spent. Because the IMF, for instance, it's now funded to several $billion by the United States. And the World Bank, I think its budget is $1 trillion or more. And these are really money being wasted. I mean, you look at bank projects, all market-led, and, can you, this, I would be really seriously for abolishing World Bank aid and funding for the IMF, and it would lead to a better world at this point in time. Okay. So yes, it's good to focus on creating alternatives, and I fully agree, that we have to be very innovative here. But even as we do that, we also have to hack off the bank and the fund and the different regional development banks because they really serve no useful purpose except to promote, market-led, quote-unquote, development that really doesn't affect or does impact on people's lives. So to me, if people say, how do we end waste? Abolish the World Bank.
There's one thing I wanted to mention when I think Bon was talking. It's interesting is because you're absolutely right that USAID was dismantled, but aid, in terms of channeling of aid, didn't stop in terms of military aid. And it wasn't just to the so-called white north. It's, I think I saw military aid to Egypt continues, military aid to Ethiopia continues. And of course, those regions or those countries are serving military interests of the United States in specific regions. So aid, specific kinds of aid were cut off, not all aid, and certainly not military aid.
Yeah, I'm working on that. That's why I presented that in a conference in Poland, that it's not really a retreat, but a reorientation of development financing and accelerating the trend that has already been happening. That is, as I mentioned, privatization of development financing and securitization, focus on defense and the military.
Well, thank you. This has been really interesting so far. Let's now turn to the final part of the discussion, and let's continue discussing how things could be improved now and in the future. So given everything we've discussed, where do you see concrete openings or the most promising opportunities for change, whether it's through solidarity, resistance, or policy action? How can we sustain hope in turbulent times? Would you, Robte, like to start?
Sure. So as a middle-aged millennial, I guess I am. I think in terms of openings, I was super, super excited, and maybe a bit too optimistically so, about the Gen Z-led protests that happened in 2025 in places like Turkey and Peru and Madagascar and where else, Nepal. And the reason I was energized by those protests is that quite often people think of Gen Z as incredibly politically apathetic, and they think of Gen Z, and sometimes I have these kinds of assumptions about Gen Zs, as being very lazy and entitled. And I think these young people across these different spheres in the so-called global South and the so-called global North just demonstrated to us that they are politically aware and they understand that structural inequality and political corruption trickle down to them and have an adverse impact on their lives, their present and their future. And they were willing to go out at the risk of their lives, at the risk of their livelihoods to make a really firm stance and speaking truth to power in a way that some of us are really afraid to do so. Because I can do this in academia, I can pontificate all day, every day. But these young people were really putting their lives at risk. And that energized me profoundly because I realized that if you're thinking about moments of rupture, moments of change, they really have always come from young people. Young people who have so much to lose, but also so much to gain. So for me, that's been a concrete example of those ruptures taking place and young people being at the forefront of that. And so what I've sort of seen is that the promise of change is not only palpable, even if it happens in bursts and peters out, because we all know that what's happened in places like Madagascar and Nepal is that even more entrenched authoritarian regimes have been established post-protests. And so that leaves us with a lot of discontentment, and even the young people who led the protests with a lot of discontentment. And we saw that in the sort of advent of what people call the Arab Spring, but young people who were at the forefront of those movements in MENA called the Revolution of Dignity, because they were essentially taking their dignity back from authoritarian leaders who had hijacked political processes. And so even though there have been disappointing aftermaths of these protest movements, the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, what young people are also internalizing is that power really concedes nothing without a struggle, right? There's a quote that I often use from African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who said that power concedes nothing without a struggle. And young people across the globe realize that, and they're willing to fight. So that left me with a lot of hope.
Would you, Walden, like to continue?
Yes, I share Robtel's enthusiasm for the Gen Z, the potential of Gen Z. And yeah, we saw it in all these different parts of the world, including my own part, where we had the protests in Indonesia, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, where young people were in fact able to change governments. So that's an opening right there, and I think there will be more of that. Now, I think the situation is the transition. After they've ousted corrupt governments, where do they go? And I think this is the situation whereby more conservative forces, appearing like they're liberal forces, try to move it in a certain direction. So that the initial enthusiasm, the initial energy really gets lost. And I think that is the moment when I think people who've been looking at these issues for alternatives for a long time should begin to move in and help because they have a fund of knowledge that can be shared with this spontaneously young people who know what they want, but really don't have a good sense of what are the mechanisms to get there, or what should be the sort of vision and paradigm so that they don't move back to sort of, a market-led kind of process, but can begin to strike out on paths that are not neoliberal. And I think quite a number of friends have in fact been working on alternative paths. And I think this is where they can really come in and be helpful, because unless they come in a very constructive way, not sort of in a teaching mode, but really cooperating with these new political forces, unless they move in, I think the old regime is going to take back power. So that is, I think, the challenge that we as progressives who've been working on this for a long time, can really input and help in terms of helping create alternative paths. My own experience here has been when the National League of Democracy, NLD, government in Myanmar in 2016 to 2021, there was an effort by a number of different NGOs to try to figure out what would be a non-neoliberal path for Myanmar to take. And the NLD of Aung San Suu Kyi, there were forces that were quite open to refusing to take the World Bank-led path and to open up alternatives. And I did get engaged at that point, and one of the things we were looking at really was how do you get, you can get a grassroots pharmaceutical industry started in which you could convert poppy growing from illegal drug use to basically medicines, And there were all those different openings. Unfortunately, the coup took place back in 2021. And all this ferment and enthusiasm of people that were ready to, hey, let's have a different path for Myanmar than those followed by the other ASEAN countries. So that was cut off. But hopefully, we can, there are lessons that we've learned from that when things open up politically, can then be applied in a more congenial democratic context.
I think I'll just have to encourage everyone to attend the conference starting tomorrow, because there will be lots of stories of hope and resistances and solidarity. And I think this is also our contribution in the struggle as academics and activists, because in the final analysis, or in the end, we will be the ones who will literally write history. And those narratives of hope and resistance and alternatives should be amplified, told and retold, because it's very important. The Trumpian zeitgeist is not just military. Trump's tenure at the White House is fleeting, but the after effects of him is longer lasting. And in the end, as in the process of legitimation and hegemony, political power does not grow out of the barrel of a gun, but power grows out from the power of ideas, and once people have that idea of hope and not despair, it's already a revolutionary act on our part. That's why we need to resist in order to exist. But as Barry reminds us, maybe it's not just enough to resist nowadays. We need to rebel against extinction.
Thank you. Let's finally discuss the long-term possibilities of humanity. So can you share with us your own vision of a better world? Looking 50 years ahead, what does a genuinely better world look like to you? And what would need to change for that future to become possible? Would you all then like to start?
Okay. Yes. During the height of globalization in the 1990s, when it seemed like globalization was the wave of the future, and I still remember that a number of us civil society activists were invited to Singapore for the first ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization. And I was wondering why they invited us. And then I realized that they wanted to show us that it was useless to resist. This was the wave of the future, and the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO would be the political canopy for this corporate-led integration of the global economy. At that point in time, we in Focus on the Global South felt, that we had to advance a totally contradictory vision to this corporate-led globalization. And we basically said that this globalization is full of contradictions in which it will unravel. And that prediction of the contradictions, in fact, had led, that it projected the collapse of globalization. The second thing that we did was to advance an alternative vision of deglobalization. So if globalization was the enemy, the most radical thing you could think about was deglobalization. And so this idea of deglobalization was advanced in the context of political struggle. It wasn't a kind of something that was cooked up in terms of academic conferences. It was really because we felt that in order to fight these institutions, you really had to advance a vision that opposed what they were trying to create for the world. And that's when a number of us got together and wrote the book called Deglobalization. And I won't go through the different elements of it, except that after the progressives launched the critique of globalization, unfortunately, the mainstream left in Europe and the United States basically compromised, and the idea of deglobalization was hijacked by the far right. Okay, and so what we're seeing now is Trump distilling this this right-wing form of deglobalization, whereas in fact deglobalization came from the progressive movement from the left. And I would just like to say here that of course this might intrude into what I'm going to say tomorrow, but since a number of you won't be here, I might as well say, what is a progressive vision of deglobalization? That is very different from Trump's view of a fractured or a deglobalized world. So one, we do not demand a withdrawal into autarky, but continued participation in the international economy, but in a way that ensures that instead of swamping it, international market forces are harnessed to assist in building the capacity to sustain a vibrant domestic economy. Two, we propose that via a judicious combination of equality-enhancing redistributed measures and reasonable tariffs and quotas, internal market will again become the engine of a healthy economy instead of being an appendage of an export-oriented economy. And so basically, these are, sort of different ideas that we propose, which would contrast to the current ultra-protectionist kind of deglobalization that is being carried out by the right, by Donald Trump. So we offered these ideas 25 years ago. The book was published in 2002, but we feel that it's still relevant. You did say that, don't worry about promoting utopian ideas. And that's the contribution to utopian ideas from our side. Thank you.
Rob, would you like to go next?
Sure. So in 2024, the Republic of Liberia, where I was born, asked me to be the 177th Independence National Orator, and it's kind of a big deal. And the title of my oration was A Radical Agenda for Reimagining Liberia. And in this oration, there was a refrain that I came up with that I kept saying over and over and over again. And by the end of the speech, the audience was saying it. And it was sort of like this beautiful chorus that we assembled together. And the refrain was, dignity must define us. And I realized that this refrain is not just about Liberia. It's a refrain that we should be using globally. Dignity must define us. And my sort of vision, utopia vision, would be abolishing systems of indignity, right? So dignity must define us as a human race, as a globe, as an international body. And so for me, the way to do that is to abolish three different isms, right? Capitalism, which you've talked about already, which I won't go into detail about. Racism, because I think capitalism and racism are inextricably tied. And then sexism. And I think if we can deal with those three isms, then we create systems of dignity. We create a world in which dignity defines all of us. And there's a beautiful book that I read quite often every year to remind myself of why I teach, why I do scholarship, why I research, and why I am in the business of not only knowledge production, but also recreating a world where everybody feels a sense of dignity. And there's a book that was written by Bell Hooks, the late Bell Hooks, African-American author activist, called Teaching to Transgress. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And she talks about these three isms as isms that we should all be dismantling in our classrooms, because education should be the practice of freedom. Education should be the practice of dignity. So that's my utopian vision of a better world.
One, please.
Yeah, my utopian vision, I started with capitalism as a problem, so it should be a post-capitalist vision. So that should come with a different mode of production that is not dependent on the military-industrial Wall Street and fossil industry. And then an alternative system of exchange that is not leading us towards a commodified world. So I'm thinking about the decommodified future, and also a different culture, a set of values. And I really think that we should start questioning value nowadays. We had that moment, but we lost that moment during the pandemic when all these alternative ideas and valuation came in. So that was a lost opportunity for us. But in this crisis moment where US so-called liberal or nationalistic capitalism is losing its legitimacy, it's an opening for us to advance a utopian vision. But how to lead to that vision? Economically, it's really very important. It's not just an idea. We need to understand the material, political economy basis of realizing that vision. So what exists now, there are lots of ideas. These are not new. I still believe that the economy should have a goal of full employment. Yeah, very important in a country also like Finland, rather than obsession to GDP growth rates. And then another economic policy that should be done would be basic incomes. Because not everybody should do productive work, but also value creative work. Because the goal should be not on commoditizing nature and human beings, but again, it should be about ecological restoration or regeneration, also the classic aspiration we have in development, which is human flourishing. And then what is a requirement for that also is a movement, a counterculture. And we can only advance change if we are part of an organization, like the Finnish Society for Development Research.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this discussion.
Can we ask?
Yep.
What is your vision?
Oh.
Well, one idea that I've had is to enable everyone to reach their potential and then make the lives for others better through this realization of this potential. That's one of my ideas. Yeah.
This is in the book.
It's not in the book actually, but it's later.
Okay.
Maybe in a new book.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
I'm sorry, your idea. Your idea?
You're putting me on the spot. I think my vision is a future where we get to some type of planetary balance, planetary balance,
Okay.
where somehow we solve the climate issue, which I feel is like the biggest existential threat that humanity faces. And then alongside that, we then focus on creating a society where each human being and child is taken care of, and world peace.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we now have some time for audience questions. And here at the front, there's a question straight away.
Hello, my name is Mikko Pyhälä, and in the last few years I've been diplomatic advisor to Stop Ecocide International, and I'm a member of its advisory council. Unfortunately, I'm not able to attend your conference, but I hope you will continue raising the same issues. You, Walden, you raised climate change, and you raised planetary issues. My idea of the better future is planetary well-being for all living species, nothing less. And nature loss is going so fast. We can't be sure whether the world will be destroyed by nuclear weapons, but we can be sure if nature loss continues, hothouse will make life impossible on this earth. Please discuss this in your conversation. I loved what you said. I'm very impressed, but you should go deeper than that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anyone like to comment?
Yeah, Miko, that's an overarching concept that we advance at the University of Uvascular. Planetary well-being. Yeah. Please come to us. They will have a conference also in May, on the Wisdom Days.
Yeah, let me be a little bit polemical because best questions are making everybody think. And so, yeah, I'm a China scholar, so I make the question from that side. And you're talking about this, what's happening as crisis of capitalism. But if I see what are discussions in China or, for example, African Union, it's actually more capitalism. It's different kind of capitalism. It is capitalism between global south. It is green capitalism, is not fossil capitalism. It is not US-led capitalism. And with the question of aid, it should replace aid with capitalism, with exchange where people are part. And so what would you think of that? So what this kind of crisis of capitalism repaired by capitalism, would it work? And what would it require?
Maybe, or should we collect comments?
Well, actually, the question is for you guys. So whoever wants to
Yeah,
start.
I mean, it's a really good question. So there's a whole kind of ideological. There've been a few books written on Afro-capitalism. You know, Tony Elumelu, the billionaire, Nigerian billionaire, has been talking about, or at least making it more mainstream, because it's kind of a scholarly way of thinking about capitalism. And I think it's provocative, it's interesting, because quite often when we're thinking about capitalism, we think about Western capitalism or capitalism that's rooted in Euro-America, but there are other forms of capitalism that existed before the colonial encounter. So Africans were trading with Europeans long before colonialism. That was a form of capitalism in terms of trade and production. And so, at the risk of sounding mainstream, I would say perhaps we need to go look at those different forms of capitalism that existed before the colonial encounter that were not predatory in the way that we see it in the 21st century kind of manifestation, and see if those forms of capitalism still exist in different guises and whether or not they're working to produce systems of dignity. And so I would be curious in terms of investigating what those different forms of capitalism look like in different specific spaces and places, without necessarily throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as they say. So, Afro-capitalism, state-led capitalism, China, for instance. Is it working to build systems such that people feel like they have self-worth, that they have dignity? Yes. I would be interested in pursuing that in terms of investigating.
Yeah, I think many of us in the Global South are quite impressed with the Chinese path to, whatever we call it, capitalism or sustainable development. And of course, it involves a great deal of, state-led processes, and it has its own unique characteristics, like the checks on corruption that seem to be very serious checks on corruption, and at the same time in terms of popular representation, there seems to be, from our point of view, a deficit where it comes to that. But if you go, for instance, if you're a person from the Global South, and you go to China at this point in time, and you're told by the World Bank, that the Chinese government, that poverty has been reduced almost to zero, and you are, so in other words, China's development, its history, its fight against the West, thus has produced, a political and social formation that probably responds to what the Chinese want. And I'm not about to be a kind of a Western critic that says, but there's a democratic deficit. No, I'm not going into that. But at the same time, when I look at our heritage in the Philippines, the challenge is not to go the Chinese way, but how do you integrate a real democracy into the process of economic transformation? And going beyond the kind of representative democracy controlled by the elites that we now have, into a more participatory democracy that is linked to the creation of sustainable development, but also economic democracy. So I would say that the Philippines has a certain history, political, economic, cultural, that, that I would say would move us to make democracy a real central part of the development process. And that's the only way it's going to work in the Philippines. So I guess there are probably different routes to a post-capitalist future. And at least now we're at the stage whereby we know that there's not just one path to the future. And I think there must be a respect for the diversity and the kind of values that people have and how they rank those values. Because as I understand it, for the Chinese, for instance, they are just completely still shocked. They're still reeling from the century of shame. And to a great extent, I think that's the way that they bring that value into the transformation of the Chinese society. So I would say respect variety.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yes?
Thank you. My name is Ratya Adiputri from University of Lapland and Uvascula. Thank you so much, speaker, for this really fresh discussion. And well, then I also refer to your book about China, that Southeast Asia is the backyard of China. But then I also want to sort of respond to what Roptel Adi said about this, it's good that Liberia is the non-permanent social security council and also this G20 in South Africa. But like it or not, multilateralism, like in the UN, has a hierarchy. Like as you said, there is this the resolution to Palestine, Ukraine, condemnation or something. But since they don't do it, they can ignore it. So that's, like it or not, it happened. It's kind of a bit hard to pursue. If the West are not doing it, they're not setting an example, it's kind of a bit hard for the Global South to lead. And especially China doesn't want to lead themselves. They want to just, being dominated by itself, but they doesn't want to share or lead the power, the global power at the end. So I was just wondering, is it I don't know, I was just trying to think about this. For example, K-pop need to be like known if they come to the US or the Europe. Is it like this, that the development or some kind of this good intention from the US or from the Western world saying that, okay, this is what we should do, that probably happen, or it's really like the global South really need to run by itself? Thank you so much.
Well, it's interesting because I think in terms of alternative futures, I often think about the fact that there are kind of two layers. So there's one layer in which we want to preach the gospel of self-reliance, where countries can do things on their own and they have agency, political agency, economic agency, social agency. But at the end of the day, you also have to think about the second layer, which is interdependence, that none of us exists in a vacuum. We're all related in some way, shape, or form, and we rely on each other for different things. And I think the reason I gave the example of the UN Security Council is what the continent of Africa is arguing is that we need to first of all, strip the 5 permanent members of their veto power, and then increase the number of countries in the so-called Global South on that UN Security Council so that there's more checks and balances, and it represents what the world actually looks like. It's not a post-World War II moment where you've got spheres of influence in that way, or even a post-Cold War moment. It's more, we've talked about this idea of multipolarity. So the UN Security Council has to reflect the globe, like in terms of what the globe looks like. And I think that's where I prefer a UN any day with all of its flaws over a board of peace as an alternative to that. And I would also say even within the UN system, there are moments and processes in which people can talk about this idea of self-reliance, that I, as a country, I as a particular body in this 190 plus countries can still do things on my own with also realizing that I need to rely on other countries for other things. And I think I'm trying to think of other institutions that represent the world as it is in terms of its holistic approach, and I can't think of any other institution besides the UN. So if the UN is flawed, it is flawed, and we can recognize that, but how do we make it less flawed? And I think that's what the A3 members of the non-permanent members of the African non-permanent members of the UN Security Council are trying to do, is to refashion a UN that is fair, that's more equitable, that's representative, and that doesn't allow a small group of people to wield so much power, clout, and influence that they derail any progress whatsoever. So I hope that answers your question, but that's kind of a clarification of what I meant by giving that example.
Okay, any more? There's a question at the back.
Hi, good evening, especially to Ka Walden, from another former faculty from the University of the Philippines. So I appreciate that it was really mentioned earlier, actually, about the teaching to transgress, or the fact that education also has a, not just a reproductive function, but a recreative function, or creative function in society. So I would bring that question, my question down to that level, especially since I'm from the educational sciences, taking my pedagogical studies here, so I focus on the classroom. So it was mentioned earlier, the instances of the youth showing that they are certainly socially aware and willing to struggle for the future that they do desire. But there also has been some evidence over the past couple of years that a significant chunk of the youth are also those, one of the demographics that are in agreement or in support of these like populist personalities or rhetoric. So as a marginally socially aware teacher who is concerned not only with his future, but also the future of his students, do you have any insights on how we could educate young children and the youth so that they actually put the people who will genuinely advance or advocate for what they want in power?
It's a really great question. It's a really big question. And I think that's why I really love that book so much, Teaching to Transgress, is because what Bell Hooks argues is that we can have an alternative indoctrination, right? Like, we talk about indoctrination as being a bad thing, but I think, yes, research and publishing and scholarship are important, but it only reaches a certain it only reaches so far. Like in terms of journal articles, everything's behind a paywall, and books, only so few people can afford to buy books. But I find that my power as a scholar, as somebody who's interested and critically engaged and an activist, is really in the classroom, right? So when my students take my Development and Social Change course, which is a critical development studies course, many of them leave fundamentally transformed after that year. And many of them also come back to me and say, there was a particular career trajectory that I had to go into international finance and banking that completely changed. So now I want to do work on sustainability, or I want to do work on social transformation, I want to do work on indigenous kind of knowledge systems. And they wouldn't have ever thought about it in that way, in terms of what's possible for them in terms of future careers, so forth and so on, had they not taken the course. And I think quite often as academics, as scholars, we don't realize the power that we have in the classroom to do positive indoctrination. And many of these young people will go on into the world of work. They'll become the lectorate. They will have these ideological ideas kind of in the back of their mind about what is possible for them, and that they don't necessarily have to choose populist leaders because there are alternatives. And I think that's why people were so excited about Zoran Mamdani, because this democratic socialist who came out of nowhere basically completely recalibrated that mayoral election. And that's why there's so much hope and kind of aspiration around his mayoral, term, because young people are looking at him and saying, wait a second, there are politicians who are not politicians. There are politicians who care about rupturing the status quo and changing the status quo. And if that's the case, why can't we have more Zoran Mamdanis kind of prop up? I see Zoran Mamdani in my classroom and my students, and I see them leave the classroom really, really empowered with these ideas, knowing that they can change systems, knowing that there's a history of changing systems, right? So one of the things that I do is there's a lesson on development and social change where I talk about development and social change in different parts of the globe. And one of the examples that I give is Maurice Bishop. You may not be familiar with him, but he was a prime minister of Grenada just for 4 years. And this man was able to completely transform Grenada's economy just in the span of 4 years. And so when they hear about Maurice Bishop, they say, okay, transformation can happen in a very, very short period of time, in bursts, and it is possible. But if we're not teaching them these alternatives, if we're not showing them that these alternatives exist, then they don't realize that alternatives are out there, not only in terms of the history of the past, but also in the present and in the future. So I think we just have to remember that we wield considerable power. I think I'm more powerful than any politician because I'm in a classroom with the next generation of people who are going to make a difference. And I don't take that lightly, and I don't think any of us in this classroom, in this room who are scholars and academics, should either. And I know, in many respects, academia doesn't necessarily value teaching, but oh my goodness, I value teaching. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's even more important than the scholarship that I produce in terms of journal articles. So sorry, I went off on a tangent, but I hope that helps in terms of, situating your teaching and making sure that you understand that you are an incredibly powerful force in the classrooms that you encounter, that you inhabit.
Thank you. My question here.
Kyle Bailey, York University. I guess my question's about contested global visions of fascism and anti-fascism. I mean, we kind of know where Donald Trump came from. The American state is the state of its own society, but also the state that spearheaded the making of capitalist globalization to an unprecedented degree. But, it's not just Trump. We're seeing the rise of the right all over the world. You have the Putins and the Modis of the world. And in Europe, where the key political economy is really about extreme dependence on the United States and now being squeezed economically and geopolitically kind of from all sides in an increasingly kind of mercantilist fashion, we're kind of probably going to see a reinforcement of that tendency of the rise of the right. So, I mean, in Britain, where the Conservative Party is collapsing, one of the oldest virtually the oldest governing party in the world is collapsing. The Reform UK party is saying that they're going to follow kind of Trump's line of having a ICE-style deportation organization. And, you know, this kind of thing was just unthinkable a few years ago, but now it's like increasingly a reality in British politics. And we see some similarly worrying tendencies still in France with Le Pen and in Germany with the Alternative for Deutschland. So I guess the question is, where do you see, and it's for all the speakers, maybe for Walden especially, because he's written a book on the rise of the right, at least that I know, maybe you guys have also written about it too. But where do you see the rise of the right in transforming the global north and in transforming Western hegemony kind of going? Because like we can laugh at the Board of Peace, but some European countries have already signed up for observer status, and the European Commission has sent a commissioner to the Board of Peace just recently also to observe. So these are, you know, should we be making light of that, or can it kind of like snowball and build over time as more right-wing governments, far-right governments, appear in the global north? And I guess the other side of the question is also in the global south, where we have all these experiences of fighting dictatorship and far-right governments. What can we kind of learn in the global north about anti-fascism and building mass democratic movements to challenge the far right?
Well, thank you for the question. Well, maybe let me begin where things are at in the United States at this point. Over the last few weeks, there has been a big encounter between the Trump administration and the people of Minneapolis. And basically, I think people just came out to oppose ICE immigration agents trying to take people without papers, or and so is this, the thing that many people are asking is that could be this sort of popular resistance that has made Trump back down slightly, could this be the future, in terms of being able to resist the rise of the right? And reproducing the Minneapolis direct action that cuts across classes and races into other parts of, into other parts of the United States. So that's one thing. The second thing is the Soran phenomenon. And as you said, this was a person that basically seemed to come out of nowhere, but he was linked to the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and through that to Bernie Sanders. So basically, this was not just, there was a heritage there. I think a progressive heritage that wasn't just, sort of a Democratic Party sort of thing. So I guess there's also just a sense at this point, that probably Trump has reached his peak, and that this kinds of resistance is going to push Democrats to take bolder stands against Trump. And, so that's, I just wanted to start from there because now it seems like the resistance in the United States has gained some hope and some leverage. And so Minneapolis does have lessons for all of us. And I would really want to see how they were able to get, in Helsinki degree weather. Okay, Minneapolis, people were out on the streets for 12, 16, 20 hours. And so that's, I just wanted to say that there are glimmers of hope in the resistance when you look at places like Minneapolis. In terms of, we also have, instances of this in the global South, as we, in our discussion of Gen Z, a number of the governments that were toppled were really authoritarian regimes, and so I guess my point is that the sharing of experiences across global North and global South lines, lived experience that's happening right now, that sort of communication of experience is so central to be able to resist the right-wing tide. I just wanted to give you an example. The Die Linke in Germany, the left party, which performed quite successfully in the recent elections. When I was interviewing their general secretary, he told me that we actually got our tactics from Zoran Mandani, and Zoran Mandani says that he learned from Die Linke. So there is this very interesting dynamic whereby people quietly are learning from one another. The door-to-door campaign that led Die Linke to get close to 10% of the vote, according to them, that was imported from New York. And the aggressive way that they portrayed themselves as the only reliable anti-fascist party did work wonders for them in terms of stemming the way that the right wing has been moving to capture the base of the left. So, very important question that you raised, Kyle. But my response to that at this point is there are glimmers now appearing in various places that we really need to look at and see how we can really learn lessons and coordinate across national and class borders.
Okay, thank you. We are unfortunately out of time. So I want to take this moment now to thank all of our panelists for such an interesting discussion and taking the time to be here tonight. I would like to thank the Finnish Society for Development Research for co-organizing this event, and a special thanks for Bon for filling in last minute. This discussion has been filmed and will be available on our YouTube channel soon for those who want to revisit the conversation. And please follow us on social media for more updates on that. And we hope to see you at our next events. Thank you so much for being here tonight.